when we hear about sexual assault or sex crimes in the newspaper or on TV news or on the radio, there's, for the most part, they're all involving, they're very brutal, and sex crime is a very brutal assault. But the ones that we hear about are the ones that involve physical force, or we see the bruising, the scarring, the evidence of the force. What people tend to not recognize is that force can also be verbal.
Yeah.
So when someone, things like threaten, using verbal threats, using intimidation tactics or fear tactics, using peer pressure, emotional coercion, saying things, using language in order to scare, manipulate, intimidate, coerce someone into compliance to sex when they really don't want to, is also considered force as well.
Yeah.
And largely, the majority of sex crimes that occur, I would say, involve more verbal force than physical.
Yeah. Which I guess, you asked that question, and instinctively I think of physical violence. So it is interesting because I feel like maybe especially high schoolers, maybe just in general, you see that so much more. But, and when you're talking to kids, or actually I guess you talk to all age groups, but when you are talking to teenagers specifically, I thought this was really interesting in the initial conversation that you're not just doing these discussions for the victims, but you're actually kind of, by definition, you have to be talking to both parts of that group. So the victims, but also people who are perpetrators of, sexual crimes or even possible perpetrators. How does that feel, and kind of how do you talk to them?
Well, I'm very direct, and I try to be as blunt and direct as possible. When I first started, I tried to, I talked to some colleagues, and I got the basic kind of outline of terminology, and I tried to be very formal when I first doing presentations, and pretty much got laughed out of the classroom because I had a hard time connecting with the students. But when I talked with some, I got to know some high school students, and I watched and I learned, and I realized that being rigid or using kind of my vocabulary or the professional vocabulary may not be effective. So I changed. When I go into classrooms now, I use appropriate labels or professional language when appropriate, but for the most part, I use whatever language is common in high school students.
Yeah.
I ask for a lot of discussion, and kids will and high school students will ask me for throw out examples or situations, and they're not everything from the kind of really polite type of raising hands and being very succinct to using euphemistic language to slang terms, and and basically I take every situation, every comment seriously, and I respond to it depending on what they're, I try to figure out what they're meaning, and if I don't understand a term, I ask, what do you mean by that? And but I'm really comfortable with talking about, because I'm talking about sexual violence and this type of issue. If talking about it often sometimes also kind of expands talking about sexuality types of issues, and I'm very comfortable, addressing those types of questions as well.
Right. Yeah. No, you'd have to be if you're in that kind of setting, I feel like. But even more, kind of, because I was just wondering, I was thinking about it, and how would you get someone who is going to commit that type of crime or force their girlfriend into sex or something like that? What kind of either statistics do you give them or stories do you tell? How do you get those kids to not do that when you're talking to them? Because it just seems like such a, that's a very intense thing to talk to them about.
Well, I think my viewpoint is, I think the majority of sexual assaults are acquaintance rapes. About 84 to 85% of reported sex crime is between people that already know each other.
Wow.
And involve, and because they're acquaintances and they know each other, whether it's dating or neighbors or casual acquaintances or family friends or relatives, there's the sexual assaults, the perpetrators, although they do choose, they know what they're doing. It's not an impulsive crime. It is a choice that the offender makes. But I think in some cases, the offender may believe it's what they're expected to do. There's one of the big stereotypes or myths that I address with my audiences is this idea that women say no when they mean yes. That women, when women are flirts, they tease, and men and boys, part of being masculine is to pursue women, and be promiscuous, or try to, quote unquote, be studly, and have a lot of dates. And I think these types of internalized messages that young and old men are receiving, they may, at some point, even though they realize they do know they're forcing sex, may feel somewhat justified in doing so. And so I think, first of all, just and they don't know exactly what the legal definition is. So talking about what the law is, giving them a clear definition as to what the laws are, I think helps and clearly setting those boundaries for them, I think helps with reduction. Also addressing what force and what consent is, and how, and that also really clarifying what consent is. That like for consent to be legal, it has to be, at least for Illinois. In Illinois, consent for sex to be legal has to be given by someone who is sober and lucid.
Oh, that's a good distinction to make.
And a lot of people don't realize that if you're under the influence of alcohol or narcotics, and we understand this, and everyone understands, if you ask about drunk driving, it's not a question, or there's no doubt. If you're under the influence, you can't drive because alcohol or drugs impair judgment and mobility. That logic carries over to sexual activity. If someone is under the influence of drugs or alcohol and their judgment and thinking is severely impaired, they're not in a position to make rational decisions. And since they're in a vulnerable position, it is just because they happen, even if they voluntarily drink or voluntarily take drugs, they don't, by doing that, they don't give up the right not to be hurt or not to be taken advantage of. And understanding what consent is, I think helps reduce, helps reduce risk or increases, helps with prevention.
Yeah, definitely. And just really quickly though, because I was going to ask this earlier, but are there any kind of statistics that you feel are particularly important to be aware of too?
Well, the other thing, one of the things